potential for schools to be learning organisations. I ask you to welcome Professor Toby Greany.
Kia ora, colleagues. Thank you, Annalise, for that scary introduction, which I feel I now have to live up to, having. But it's great to be here. So huge thanks to the university, but particularly to Annalise and to Susan, who've hosted me brilliantly. I've been here coming up for 3 weeks now, and it's just been fascinating to kind of spend a bit of time visiting some of your schools, but other schools here in the Canterbury region, talking at the ministry and up in Wellington, kind of meeting people there and kind of getting a sense of how things work for you. And there's clearly a lot of change going on here in New Zealand at the moment, so it's a fascinating time. What I want to talk about, as Annalise said, is schools as learning organisations and implications for policy and practice. It's quite a risky approach in a way. I'm not talking about my own kind of research specifically. It's more of a kind of thought experiment, if you like, bringing together a number of strands of work. I'm doing some work with the OECD around this topic, not yet published, but it kind of draws on that. It draws on work by a colleague of mine at the UCL, Louise Stoll, who's published on schools as learning organisations for the OECD. And I'll kind of make this point as I go through as well, but I mean, a lot of this is, you know, it's kind of draws on a number of theoretical perspectives, kind of learning organisation, knowledge mobilisation, learning theory, if you like. There's some empirical basis for some of it, but I don't want to overclaim for that. I think particularly in school, I mean, kind of in other sectors, there's been more work done, but in the education sector, I'm not kind of saying with absolute confidence, we know what this looks like, and here's the evidence that demonstrates what it looks like. I'm more kind of tentatively trying to suggest this is what we think it looks like, and then particularly wanting to explore, if you wanted schools to be learning organisations, what would you need to think about in terms of kind of the governance of schools and school systems to try and help that to happen more consistently, which seems apposite given that you've got the kind of review of tomorrow's schools going on at the moment and a lot of thinking going on in the system about kind of what kind of system do we want and what kind of school system do we want to support in the future. So stepping back to kind of position where this comes from, I guess it's always helpful to think, where do we sit in the wider context? If we think about kind of the challenges we face at different levels of our system, and we could debate what we would put at each of these levels, but the debates I'm hearing here sound similar to the ones often in England, where we have this kind of set of challenges that we face. But I think what's interesting is if we draw lines between these levels, we see how things that are happening at a global level, to pick globalisation, which is changing the way we live, the way we work, the way we consume. What that kind of often ends up looking like at a national level is this kind of obsession with competitiveness and a view that if it was ever the case we could have education systems that educated a small elite with the majority of the population having a relatively basic education. That's no longer the case. We want all our children to achieve their potential. And that can then mean that at local level, we must have school, at least, you know, every school a good school, if not every school a great school. And for leaders in schools, what that can feel like is that your job is actually to kind of implement change which is handed down to you from above. You know, policy is kind of pushed down and school leaders are then charged with kind of making it a reality in schools. But if we draw a different set of lines on that same slide and think about some of these global challenges that we face, and we could put other things there. I mean, you could arguably put the rise of populism, certainly in kind of Europe and the States, you're kind of, and coming this way perhaps, you know, as challenges for education systems. We put that together with the kind of lives of vulnerable children who are often affected by those global challenges coming into schools. And then that statistic that about a third of the cohort starting school today will live on into the 22nd century, and we can't imagine what the rest of the 21st century will be like, let alone what kind of learning and what kind of learners we'll need for the 22nd century. Then you can see that leadership becomes a very different job. It's about actually how do we try and imagine the kinds of education that are needed to equip young people today for lives in which we know that they will have significant collective challenges to face, but we're not necessarily clear about kind of quite how they might best go about that. So just to pick out one illustration of that, this was something I spotted in the PISA, one of the volumes where they draw together the evidence around kind of the well-being surveys that they do around the PISA survey. And I thought it was interesting to see this kind of incredible increase in the number of hours or minutes per day spent by 15-year-olds on a typical weekday outside school, and particularly the difference between the white diamonds and the blue bars, which is the increase between 2012 and 2015, which seems remarkable that to take New Zealand, for example, an increase from around about 100 minutes a day in 2012 up to more than 160 minutes a day in 2015. One indicator, and I'm not drawing any kind of huge conclusions from this, but I think just one indicator of the rapidity with which children's lives are changing. And we know, I think, what is clear is that that can then have a backwash effect in terms of schools and how children engage with schools. The OECD identify that what they call extreme internet users, young people who are spending more than 6 hours a day online, tend to overall score 30 points lower in all PISA subjects than those who use the internet less. So it does seem to be a correlational difference, at least, between high levels of internet usage and staying online too late at night and so on and so forth, and what then happens in school. So schools, I know here, because I've been visiting a few this week, you're thinking about kind of issues of well-being, of kind of how do we help children with a whole set of issues going on in their lives, while still having to think about the things that we've been thinking about for the past few decades in terms of learning, achievement, progress, and so on and so forth. All of which, arguably, I thought I'd just show you that you'll be pleased to know that the United Kingdom is ahead of you in this league table. So we didn't do the 2012 PISA, I don't think, but in 2015 we were on 188 minutes a day on a typical weekday. All of which I think is kind of part of the argument for why we need schools to be operating as learning organisations. Yes, they need to be absolutely focused on classroom practice, on the quality of teaching, on the quality of learning and the kind of outcomes that can be achieved through that. But the argument is that increasingly they also need to be good at this kind of wider engagement with the environment, with engagement with children's lives, and thinking about how they can work productively, whether on their own, in networks, working with other services. I know there's a lot of work here at the moment around kind of mental health and bringing together health and education services around that, for example, as a good example of the kind of ways in which this might, what this might look like in practice. Drawing together that evidence, Louise Stoll, as I mentioned, published with Marco Kools this pamphlet, and there's a kind of longer paper that sits behind that around what makes a school a learning organisation. I think broadly it kind of brings together these three strands of thinking over the past few decades. The kind of work on organisational learning by people like Giles and Hargreaves, work on learning organisations by Peter Senge and others, and then probably more recently in the last kind of 15, 20 years, the really fertile strand of work, I think, has been around knowledge management, and people like Nanaka and Takuchi thinking about how do we make explicit our knowledge, our expertise, our practice in ways which allows us to share it and to learn from and with each other. What are the kind of underpinning processes that best support that process? As part of the review I've been doing for the OECD, we've been looking at systems around the world where in education they've focused kind of explicitly on trying to develop schools as learning organisations. And Singapore has probably been doing this for the longest. Going back to the kind of late 90s, they were already talking about thinking schools, learning nation. More recently, the Netherlands, Wales, Norway, other systems actively trying to think about what does this look like and how do we try and build a policy framework which enables it to happen more systematically. Equally, having said that, I wouldn't say that any of them have really been evaluated in a way that you can kind of start to say with confidence, here's what it looks like. Singapore's doing it this way and they're getting this kind of, impact as a result, whereas the Netherlands is doing it this way, and they're seeing these kind of changes as a result. It seems to be that we're all feeling our way to try and get the right balance a lot of the time, I think, between the educational focus. We want to continue to see the quality of teaching, the quality of learning, and the outcomes, the kind of traditional educational outcomes improving, but at the same time trying to think about, well, how does that broaden? How does it look if you start to broaden it out? I was in Singapore in January this year, and it was fascinating the way in which they do everything very systematically, but they've kind of, they've approached it with their usual vigour, and, every single primary school they've built a new gymnasium, they've got new sports teachers, everyone's got a music teacher, everyone's learning a musical instrument. It's a very kind of comprehensive and impressive approach. It certainly isn't one that I could imagine happening in England to the same extent, and I can't really see how it doesn't seem as if that's the kind of approach you would take here in New Zealand. So inevitably with these things, we can learn from other systems, but we can't necessarily extrapolate exactly how it might then adapt for our context. Louise and Marco use this definition of schools as learning organisations. An organisation that has the capacity to change and adapt routinely to new environments and circumstances as its members, individually and together, learn their way to realising their vision. It reminded me of I did a review a few years ago of leadership in other sectors beyond education, and we interviewed chief executives from the private sector, from other parts of the public sector, from the voluntary sector, to try and understand how were they leading change, how were they thinking about kind of leadership in an increasingly complex environment. And we've always talked in the literature about kind of leaders as boundary spanners, this idea that the leader is somebody who goes out and kind of sees what's happening in the wider world and then brings those insights back to the organisation and helps to kind of span the boundaries so that the organisation is able to adapt and respond to a changing external environment. What was clear from the study that I did a few years ago was that these leaders didn't see it as just their role. It wasn't the chief executive or the director who was going out and doing that boundary spanning. They were trying to create quite permeable organisations at every level. They were encouraging staff to volunteer. They were encouraging staff to use social media. They were encouraging staff to be engaged with other partner organisations doing similar kinds of work, because they recognised that organisations now need to learn so quickly and to adapt so constantly that it's not a case of kind of spotting a trend and then adapting to it. It's a case of trying to create a permeable organisation that responds continuously and learns continuously as it goes. But we know that schools are not necessarily the best places at organisational learning. I mean, actually, Hemsley Brown's work, I think, is a really good kind of articulation of some of the challenges, because schools are driven by routines. Teachers are in the classroom, and it's difficult to get time out to spend time kind of thinking about, engaging with, discussing, reflecting, and then acting in response to all this change that's going on. It can actually be quite difficult for schools to operate as learning organisations. Louise and Marco talk about these 7 dimensions that they see as necessary for schools to be thinking about if they want to become learning organisations. It's kind of interesting to me that often you see these kind of descriptions of what makes a great school, and it has, the big pillars that you would expect to see: a broad and balanced curriculum, high quality pedagogy, strong student engagement, and so on and so forth. And yet none of these features appear here in the 7 dimensions. I think they're taking those as read, and they're focusing particularly then on what are the kind of learning, and particularly the kind of organisational learning aspects that needs to be in place. I guess what I would pull out from this list, clearly it's about learning of staff and students and the kind of vision for that at the heart of it. I think there's a lot in here about culture, the kinds of cultures that allow collaborative learning, staff working with each other, professional learning, the kind of Chris Winch and others talk about teaching as a professional endeavour, and I think that's at the heart of this notion of continual learning, reflecting on values and beliefs that underpin that practice and that learning, and engaging with others in an improvement journey. They're very explicit about learning from the external environment and from the larger system. And I think then they're also very clear that it's about kind of this culture of inquiry, innovation and exploration. Looking at where are we strong, where do we need to improve, and how do we now go about that improvement, and how do we draw in existing research which tells us, the kind of, so that we can build on the shoulders of what's gone before, but equally, as we try out new approaches, how do we evaluate those and try and get better at evaluating our practice as we go, so that we're learning and improving, not simply following up a blind alley. I guess for me, it comes together. I love this quote from Judith Warren Little, and I think it kind of captures really what this idea of schools as a learning organisation has to be about. Imagine a school in which you taught better simply by virtue of teaching in that school. What would such a school be like? And I think what we know from the work of people like Sam Twistleton and others is that schools which are good at this, where teachers are continually learning and learning to be better simply by being in that environment, they're explicit about their practice, about their pedagogy, and that fits with the knowledge mobilisation literature. We're clear about, well, this is what we think good looks like, but we are also prepared to interrogate the values and beliefs that underpin that, and the kind of, we're able to articulate what we think makes that great pedagogy or some area of practice. They're developmental and scaffolded. It's clear that, there is a journey that you are on, and we're all learners and we can all get better, but we also scaffold that learning. So we provide you with mentors, with coaches, with opportunities to learn and continually think about how to improve your practice. But equally, we're not going in all directions at the same time. We're striving for a level of consistency in our practice so that we can kind of aspire and be clear about what we're aiming for. So, if that's what we're kind of broadly thinking about in terms of what we mean by a school as a learning organisation, what kind of leadership do we need in order to develop schools as learning organisations? What kind of leaders and leadership do we need? We know from the work of Ken Leithwood, Viviane Robinson, clearly, here in New Zealand, and the best evidence synthesis, Chris Day, David Hopkins and so on, Alma Harris in the UK, a number of meta-reviews of evidence around leadership, which points towards, particularly, I think, the importance of learning-centred or instructional leadership, focusing on the processes of learning, being passionate and curious about how children learn, but also about how adults learn. Jeff Southworth talks about learning-centred leadership having 3 dimensions. Modelling, this is what I'm talking about. Monitoring, keeping your eye on it, knowing where's the good, where's the areas that we need to get better at, and dialogue. Engaging in constant, continual dialogue with colleagues so that you're talking about the practice and you're getting clear about it and you're helping people to make steps forward with that. So I think this is kind of the evidence base in traditional schools, if you like, not necessarily schools as learning organisations, but I think it's important that we kind of keep hold of that as we think about what we might need for schools as learning organisations. So I think we need that idea of learning-centred or instructional leadership. Chris Day's work particularly would argue, and I think this is, kind of well evidenced, that it's also about combining that with the transformational leadership, being able to articulate a vision, which is what motivates people to come to work in the morning, which is what about, this is where we're trying to get to, this is the kind of outcomes we want to achieve, this is the kind of learning that we value. Equally important, and I think, again, well evidenced, is this idea of distributed leadership. It's not the hero head, it's not the hero principle, it's about trying to share that leadership and make it sure that it's a shared endeavour, which is where transformational leadership is important, because it brings everyone together, striving towards a common goal. Some of these other areas that I've got on the slide, evidence-informed, ethical, system leadership, adaptive, servant, and so on and so forth. There's a million adjectives for leadership, of course, and everyone's got their own pet model. Certainly the importance of values and the kind of ways in which values ensure that they underpin decision-making in terms of leadership, putting children at the centre of decision-making around school improvement, school effectiveness, equally important in terms of then creating a culture in which there's high trust and high reciprocity. All seems really important. I guess, my sense for schools as learning organisation is that we then need to think about two things in particular. First of all, this kind of idea of systems thinking, systems leadership, which comes from the learning organisational kind of research. Again, Viviane Robinson talks very well about this, uses this very powerfully, I think, in terms of talking about conversations that leaders have within schools, how to make sure that you're engaging with underpinning values and beliefs when you're talking about change, so that you begin to actually build shared understandings about what you're trying to do and why it's important, not simply bypassing those underpinning values and beliefs and kind of trying to impose change from above. Here, I guess I'm talking about it more in terms of, well, I think it's exactly the same model, this difference between single loop learning and double loop learning. In the single loop, you start with where you're wanting to get to. You think about what you might do, you develop your strategies and you implement them. But then, if it doesn't seem to work, you either get defensive and you deny responsibility and blame it on the learner or the parents or whatever else, or you go back round the circle again and we'll think, well, if we just do it again, we just work harder, we just put on some extra catch-up classes on a Saturday morning, then it might work, rather than thinking, actually, we need to rethink this. Maybe we need to go back round the double loop and think about, what are we trying to do here? What are the values and beliefs that sit behind the actions we've been taken? How might we re-engage with that differently to think about attendance, behaviour, some of the more intractable issues sometimes that schools face? So I think it's partly about that kind of ability to engage in double loop learning. I think the transformational leadership probably becomes more acute, more kind of even more important in this environment. If it's an environment of rapid change and we're asking our colleagues to do things differently, to engage differently with other service providers, for example, then being able to articulate, why are we doing this? Why is it important? How do we keep this simple and kind of manageable while still being kind of asking good questions and being prepared to engage in dialogue around that seems increasingly important in a context of rapid change. And then drawing on complexity and kind of ideas from complexity, I think increasingly important here comes this idea of feedback loops. And I really like the work of Harry Daniels and Anne Edwards on rule bending as a good example of that. When we try and have a set of rules for a certain set of performance that we want to achieve, often, and their work often is drawing in kind of social services, where in England over the last 10, 15 years, the response to kind of court cases where local authorities have been had up for not following sufficiently the kind of procedures when it comes to child protection issues has led to a culture in which they've become obsessive about those rules and the kind of bureaucracy driving everything, and actually in order to cover their backs rather than necessarily get the best outcome for children. And what Harry and Anne would say is, when you spot professionals on the front line who are breaking those rules because they're trying to make the system work for children, don't treat that as something to be punished, treat it as something to be learned from, because actually that's where you can see where the rules are no longer really working for the children that you're serving, and you need to rethink how you're doing it. So that's a good example for me of a kind of rule bending as a feedback loop, which can then inform how do we now think this differently about this, because it's just not working at the moment, which takes us back around that double loop process again. And emergence as a kind of, we've tried some things, we're starting to see some patterns emerge, but we're prepared to kind of look at the data and try and understand, what are we learning from this? Let's not just take the kind of first pass at it, let's really think deeply about what's emerging from this data, these data that allow us to think differently about how we work. So I think systems thinking as an important aspect of schools as learning organisations. I think the other really important aspect of this is kind of leading in networks and in partnerships, where, going back to that definition that I put up that Louise and Marco use about the school engaging with its external environment, and I think this is kind of starting to get into some of the issues around tomorrow's schools and kind of the future shape of the school system here in New Zealand, it seems very clear that we've focused on the individual the organisation of the school and kind of holding schools accountable and thinking about schools as the really important unit for education in England and here in New Zealand. And yet increasingly, if we want joined-up solutions and we want schools to be more engaged externally, then we need to think about leadership across networks and how we build stronger networks of schools. Where this diagram, arguably a bit crude, but also I think helpful in kind of highlighting that when you're thinking about leading a single institution over on the left for you and for me, then it takes you towards that traditional notion of kind of hero leadership, and that's where it's kind of possibly unhelpful, but this idea of kind of setting direction, commanding authority, being accountable and so on. You're very much the leader in charge of your organisation. But what we know, I think, whilst there are some generic skills down the middle, thinking strategically, communicating well, developing a shared purpose and so on, which are helpful within an organisation, as we move towards the right and think about leadership in a partnership, the ability to control and to kind of lead from the front or from the top through positional authority becomes less and less viable. We need to think about leading with other professionals, possibly in other schools, but equally in other services. And in order to do that, we need to think about persuading through vision, about understanding different perspectives, modelling what we mean by collaboration, being prepared to take the hit if sometimes that's about getting better outcomes because it can't all be about my institution every time. Being able to influence, persuade, what Wangen and Hudson call collaborative thuggery, being able to kind of move things forward sufficiently that you can see the actual benefits of the collaboration, whilst nevertheless trying to kind of demonstrate the integrity that you need in order to build trust. And the misspelling at the bottom, co-constructing solutions, being able to kind of co-design with others what's the best way to move forward with this issue, because that's how you build ownership and shared endeavour, rather than just forging ahead and telling everyone that this is what we're doing. I've been using this when I've been visiting schools this week, some of the Kahawiako communities of learning. It's kind of work that I've developed working with partnerships in England. I think one of the tricky bits with this is how do you then keep all of that potential complexity simple enough and straightforward enough that you can actually embed it within an organisation so that it becomes meaningful. And I think this idea from Winters and Saluku about routines and organisational routines, enabling routines, is helpful for that. So I think my argument would be that where you're working in a partnership and you're trying to build a number of schools together as learning organisations, it's helpful to think what's the professional development journey and pathway for staff at every level. PLD, isn't it, Susan? We use CPD, you use PLD. How do you get the right balance between the individual's needs, but also the organisational and collective needs in terms of how people progress and how you use that to try and move knowledge around the partnership? But in order to avoid that becoming chaotic and potentially unequitable, I think what's helpful is to think, can we limit it to, probably no more than 2 or 3 enabling routines that become key mechanisms for shaping how we do things around here, how we learn around here. So an enabling routine for me is something that's it's tightly specified in terms of the process, but it's loose in terms of how it can then be applied and adapted for different contexts. So in this slide, I'm arguing, you might have one that's pedagogically focused. And in England, a lot of schools are using Japanese lesson study as a model for that, where you usually have triads, groups of 3 teachers planning a lesson together. Each of them teaches it. The other 2 observe. Whilst they're observing, they're looking for how particular children are engaging with the learning, and then coming back together and reflecting on that and thinking about, okay, how did that go? That worked well for you, didn't work so well for those children. Why was that? What can we learn from that? All well structured, well supported, drawing on evidence and so on as you go, but a really powerful process for enabling professional learning in any context, any phase, any school, I would argue. Secondly, I've got one around leadership, in this case, incremental coaching. And then thirdly, one which is school improvement focused. where in England, again, there's an increasingly popular, partly because we have such a punitive accountability system, but I don't think this has to be just about serving the needs of hierarchical accountability. I think it's also about good professional learning. Schools reviewing each other, so a team from the partnership drawn together, invited into a school, usually with a focus on a particular area of practice that you want them to look at for the day, and they'll spend a day doing learning walks, looking at books, talking to colleagues, drawing together their sense of, this is going really well, but I would suggest that you now focus on this and this in order to move it forward. Feeding that back, and usually then, or in the best examples, kind of spending time helping to actually then plan, and how can we support you with that? What expertise have we got that we can help you move forward with, so that it becomes a collaborative and collective process. So I think leaders need, I would argue, these kind of systems thinking, understanding adult learning and how to embed it within the organisation, and how to lead in a partnership context as critical skills if they're going to lead schools as learning organisations. All of that underpinned by a culture of trust and reciprocity and a sense of shared accountability and agency. It's not about one partner dominating or simply doing it to serve the external accountability purposes. It's trying to build a sense of shared and collective accountability and agency. So if we jump now to the Tomorrow's Schools review and kind of what all this might mean in terms of the future shape, possibly, of any school system, but thinking about New Zealand, I think I've read Kathy Wiley's work for years. I think it's fantastic, the way in which she's kind of tracked the development of the school system back since the late 80s, when you moved towards this kind of quite radically devolved school-based management, every school having its own council, and very little kind of structure around that model. We did a similar thing in England. We kept our local authorities because it's so much bigger that it kind of almost couldn't work without it, but we've been getting rid of them since 2010, so we've kind of nearly caught up with you. And I think Kathy's work particularly highlighting the challenges with that in terms of competition then, because schools are competing for resources, and as she highlights, schools closing their doors, not sharing their knowledge, not looking outwards and learning from and with each other in the way that we've talked about in terms of schools as learning organisations, but actually trying to keep hold of their teachers, keep hold of their knowledge, so that the competitor didn't get any competitive advantage from that. So my guess is that Kathy's on the panel that's part of the review team, that they're looking at ways to try and counteract some of these less positive aspects of the system. And you could see development of initiatives like the Kahuiaku as a good example of beginning to build a system that is more collaborative, but facing some of these historic challenges as it goes of, we're trying to collaborate, but we're also in competition with each other, so it will only go so far in some instances. So I'm going to do now a very quick run through of kind of my take on some of the key strands of thinking about school system governance before coming to set out the model that I've been working on for the OECD. Michael Barber's work has been tremendously influential around the world in recent years. The work he did at McKinsey's particularly, how the world's best performing school systems come out on top, and how the world's most improving school systems keep getting better. At the heart of it, he's had this idea throughout of kind of adapting your approach to reform depending on the context that you're in. So his argument is that if you want to move from a system that's awful to adequate, then you take a very different approach to moving from adequate to good or good to great. If you're moving from awful to adequate, he would argue, if you don't have enough teachers and don't have enough desks and you're just trying to get the basics in place, then you need to be very prescriptive and top-down and drive change from the centre. But once you've got that in place and you're starting to build a kind of a stronger sense of professionalism across the school system, then you're moving from adequate to good, then your job at the centre is to try and kind of define professional standards and kind of set expectations, but increasingly the profession is taking control. And in moving from good to great, his argument would be that quote from Joel Klein in New York, you prescribe adequacy, but you unleash greatness, that the government and the centre, the ministry, can no longer they're not the ones closest enough to the action, they don't understand enough about what's going on in classrooms, they need to step back and let the profession drive the next stage of reform. And this thinking has been very influential in England, at least in the kind of rhetoric of policy, if not always in the practice. This idea that we're going to give schools more autonomy and we trust you and it's over to you and you must drive the future. And then realising that that's problematic in all sorts of ways, because whilst you get some great things happening, it's very inequitable because many schools don't have the capacity or the expertise or whatever it might be to really take advantage of that kind of model. Then, in particularly kind of informed by developments in Ontario, one of the school systems that's seen kind of probably the most rapid improvement in terms of PISA and TIMSS outcomes over the years. Michael Fullan, Andy Hargreaves, Ben Levin, all articulating this kind of tri-level model. How do we try and get alignment between the centre, the district, the local authority, whatever it might be, the middle tier, and the school around a small number of ambitious yet achievable goals? And then, once we've got that alignment, how do we build capacity, which is not just about kind of money, but it's also about skills and expertise, and how do we try and make sure that not just schools have the right expertise, but actually people working in the district, people working in the ministry are all working in the same way and have the right skills and right kind of capacity to be able to make that successful, continuous learning, focused approach successful. And then the kind of model that I've used with Rob Hyam in my most recent research, published a few weeks before I came here, we tracked change across the school system in England over the course of 4 years, where there's been very rapid changes, and we wanted to understand kind of how leaders were responding to those changes and whether or not the government's rhetoric of a self-improving school system was really becoming a reality or not. And the quick answer is no, not really. And we used this framework from governance theory, which argues that you've got these 3 mechanisms for coordinating any aspect of public life. And the kind of traditional narrative would be that, often post-war systems were quite bureaucratic, driven through the hierarchy, through statute, through the bureaucracy, through the accountability framework, but that by the 80s, there was a dissatisfaction with that. It was seen as insufficiently flexible, insufficiently responsive to the needs of the consumer. And so there was this shift towards markets and a belief that if we drive out autonomy, we deregulate, we encourage choice so that parents can choose the school and the funding follows the learner, for example, then we'll see a much more innovative, responsive, high-quality system. But then, in the last 10, 15 years, a recognition that that's problematic. It's actually very clear that marketized systems become increasingly inequitable because certain parents have more ability to choose, more appetite for choice than others. And so you get stratification between schools, the schools that are the popular schools and the schools that are the sink schools, as we would call them in England, the unpopular school, and a local status hierarchy in between, with schools competing with each other to try and move up and become the school of choice, but not necessarily focusing actually on the core of quality of teaching and learning, focusing more on, have we got a fancy swimming pool or whatever it might be. So a move towards networks in the hopes that that could help to rejoin and kind of mitigate some of the impact of hierarchy and markets. But of course, the reality is it's not so simple as kind of from hierarchy to markets to networks, because as schools are being asked to form networks in Kahuiako and so on and so forth, they're still subject to aspects of hierarchy and the kind of top-down policy-driven change that I talked about at the beginning, and they're still trying to compete with each other within a market environment often. And so the challenge is that networks themselves start to often then reflect those same characteristics and have their own internal hierarchies and so on and so forth. And then most recently, the OECD, Tracy Burns at the OECD, drawing on complexity theory, has argued that education systems are complex systems. They have multiple stakeholders, multiple kind of dimensions, which makes it impossible to drive change in the way that kind of Michael Barber or the tri-level model is insufficient, given how complex these issues are. And so she and others have argued Effective governance in these systems needs to focus on processes rather than on structures. Things like stakeholder engagement, how do we hear the voice of learners, the voice of different stakeholders in the system and try and respond to them. In the process, being flexible, adapting to change and unexpected events, not assuming we can simply write a strategy and follow it for 5 years without change. Investing in capacity building, stakeholder involvement, open dialogue so that we build consensus as we go. Trying to keep a whole of system perspective and align different roles and balance tensions between different aspects of the system. And all the while harnessing evidence and research in order to inform policy and reform. And I think this is a very helpful framework. I think sometimes it underplays. I'll come on to kind of my implied critique of some of this. I mean, I think it's helpful if it shifts practice in ministries that are very accustomed to being able to try and dictate from the centre. Equally, there's an argument that legitimacy, you need your democratically elected government to continue to say, actually, we were elected in order to achieve certain things in education, and therefore we're going to try and achieve those things. And we've listened to our different stakeholders, and we've now got a plan. So it's a kind of case of, I think, trying to balance those things out and not taking one single approach. So then, to conclude, the framework that I'm developing with the OECD starts with 2 core premises. If we want schools to be learning organisations, we need the system that sits around them to be a learning system. Seems self-evident to me that we need, whether it's the district, the local authority, the ministry, to be as much focused on, and I've used deliberately, obviously, the same definition from Louise and Marco. They too need the capacity to change and adapt routinely to new environments and circumstances as their members individually and together learn their way to realising their vision. They too need to be explicit about shared values and shared vision. They need to engage in the kind of double loop learning and systems thinking that I've talked about so that they can productively support schools as schools attempt to do the same thing. So they need to model it. Secondly, I would argue, and this is kind of a trend in a number of people working in this space at the moment, that you need a middle tier, or you need some kind of middle to be bringing the system together. And a system that you have here still of kind of very, very autonomous schools with very limited ability to kind of create a coherence at a middle tier level above schools, whether that's a region, a Canterbury region, or whether that's a city. I don't know what level it sits at, but my argument would be that you do need schools to be working together within a framework at a kind of level that's not national, but sits between national and school, and which allows for a level of coherence, a level of learning to happen, because you can't, my experience, the research in England shows, simply leaving it to schools to form networks and saying get on with it doesn't lead to equity, because some schools do it very well, but some schools don't. Andy Hargreaves has been talking about the difference between leading in the middle and leading from the middle. Leading in the middle, he would argue, is a kind of more traditional model, the kind of buffer between the centre and the school, whereas he would argue leading from the middle is about trying to create a kind of coherent system at local level in which lots of people are contributing and coherence is emerging in the kind of complexity way that Tracy Burns was talking about. I guess I'd sit somewhere in the middle. I think you need that level of kind of everyone having a voice and everyone contributing to it, but I think you also need an aspect of actually who's the referee on the pitch, who gets to make final decisions, who's policing things like admissions to try and minimise the role of the market in all of this, because if you haven't got somebody playing that role, then a lot of the competitive behaviours will remain strong. So putting that together, schools as learning organisations, systems that are learning, and middle out change, some kind of middle focus alongside schools continuing what they're doing or becoming learning organisations. Underpinning that, 3 things. You need a shared vision, and you need to know that you're all pulling in the same direction, and I would argue that's about putting equity and outcomes at the heart of that and being really clear that this is the kind of moral purpose that drives what we're doing, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Building the skills for systems thinking and leadership. We can't assume that these are going to simply emerge. I think we have to think actively about how do we develop them, what do they look like, and how do we try and identify the next cadre of leaders who are going to play these roles. And getting the balance right between structure and agency. I think this is almost the biggest challenge and the kind of, at least the one where the evidence points in some directions, but I don't think gives us complete clarity. We know that school autonomy is associated with improved pupil outcomes. We know that giving schools decision-making rights over the curriculum and over pedagogy is associated with improved outcomes. So I think there's a strong argument that schools need to continue to have a strong level of kind of autonomy and be able to shape their approach. But I'm also arguing at the same time we need a level of structure around this. And if we're going to have a middle tier, some of the things schools currently do, or some of the kind of autonomy that they currently have, might need to become a bit more structured in order to make it work more coherently. And then in the middle of that, so I've got those 6 elements, and then in the middle, the 7 dimensions from Louise and Marco's framework that I've already talked about, the school as the learning organisation. And at the national and the provincial, or the middle tier level, a set of activities, behaviours, ways of working, which I'll say a little bit about, but I don't have time to go through in every single item in great detail. But essentially, these are what I'm trying to describe in terms of how the national or provincial level and the local middle tier level might operate in order to become learning systems. Just coming back to this point about equity and outcomes, I think Mel Ainsco's work on equity and ecologies of equity is really helpful, reminding us that if you think about equity as kind of, a systemic challenge, we know people like Wilkinson and Pickett, the spirit level, that societies which have greater equity in terms of health outcomes, in terms of every single area of life, also will have greater educational equity, so that we have, it's societies which are unequal tend to have unequal outcomes in terms of education, and so these things are all linked, and this is really the point that Mel's making. So we need to think about between school factors, that some schools might have different intakes, different capacities and so on. Beyond school factors, what's happening in children's lives, how are other services helping or supporting or not with those aspects of children's lives. And thirdly, what are the within school challenges for schools serving the most disadvantaged communities? Where I think there's some really helpful work from the OECD on this, where they've brought together a lot of evidence in this 2012 report, Equity and Quality in Education. And they say there's a number of things that policy can do at the centre to try and get equity into the heart of the system: eliminate grade repetition, manage school choice to avoid segregation and increased inequity, minimise the role of the market, as I've said, make funding responsive to students' and schools' needs, eliminate early tracking, streaming, ability grouping, and defer student selection to upper secondary level. Pretty sure you don't do a lot of streaming here, do you? But you do quite a lot of setting by ability grouping, which would also be true in England. And then focus support on the most disadvantaged schools, strengthen and support school leadership, ensure effective classroom learning strategies, stimulate a supportive school climate and environment for learning, attract, support and retain high-quality teachers to work in these schools, and prioritise linking schools with parents and communities. So there's a set of things that policy needs to do to try and make sure that systems are equitable and to design that into the approach that it adopts, I would argue. And then finally, just to finish, a few thoughts which kind of go back to that framework that I showed you. The work in Ontario has shown, and this is really difficult, it's also there in the McKinsey reports as well, that constant political change and policy change is one of the huge challenges we face. We need to demonstrate that we're kind of responding in a democracy to the electorate, of course. I'm not arguing against that. But I'm attracted by things like in Finland, they have a regular cycle. They review the curriculum every 10 years. It's done through a stakeholder model, education, employers, societal groups come together and make decisions. This is the curriculum we want, and then we stick with it for 10 years. I'm interested in, could you think other areas of practice that you start to try and take it out of kind of short-term policy making cycles and say once every 10 years we will review the accountability framework and then we'll stick with it. Once every 10 years we'll think about teacher qualification and kind of quality, and then we'll try and implement it in a way that becomes a bit less cyclical. Clearly that requires political parties to come together and kind of make a pact and think, yep, we're going to try and put a long-term solution around this rather than necessarily always change it every time we're elected. Lots of this work talks about ministries of education not being fit for purpose, not having the skill set needed to try and lead change. So I think there's an inherent kind of need to think about what kind of skills do we need at the centre to make this successful, and what's the purpose of the ministry in relation to all of this, and what happens at middle tier level, what happens at school level. Accountability, legitimacy and fairness. I mean, there's been lots of, I'm struck by, you're doing some really innovative things here in New Zealand. You know, your innovative learning environments, for example. Some systems that have tried to do really ambitious, innovative things with their curricula have had big kickbacks from teachers and then the media and then parents, because it's seen as, but hang on, I want my child to have the same education that I had. I don't want all this fancy 21st century skills stuff, or whatever it might be. So I think there's a really tricky and important discussion to kind of keep in mind around legitimacy for change and how that's built, and how stakeholders absolutely have a voice in that, so that it's not seen as something as the education profession kind of imposing its own will on things. And I think that also comes back to accountability, where actually, you know, being clear about the outcomes, holding schools to account for outcomes, and then being able to publish, this is how we're doing and this is what we're doing to get better, is a really important part of any school system to ensure that there is transparency and the public can see how we're doing. And then, so that feeds into that second point, the need for an architecture for knowledge governance. How are we doing? How are we identifying what's working, and how are we learning about how to get better? I think the role for government is absolutely to keep that whole system perspective, which is partly about overcoming inertia, because there will almost certainly be schools or places which have less capacity to engage in reform than others. Often we see rural and coastal areas in England slower to engage than the urban areas, for example. And so there's a lot of focus in terms of, well, how do we now build capacity in those areas? And I'm sure you'll have similar challenges in New Zealand. And I think thinking about where and how do we need to build capacity, what are the kind of skill sets we need, and investing in that and seeing that as part of the change strategy is really important, particularly those processes for co-design. At middle tier level, how do we build horizontal accountability and agency? I think that comes through powerful networks. I think where you've got strong networks, they can hold each other to account through the kinds of processes I've talked about, like peer review. But can the accountability framework, does it need to shift from being ERO looking at single schools to ERO looking at networks and holding them accountable, for example? But then the networks have got to be prepared to step up and say, yeah, we will look after each other and we will make sure we're all succeeding. We won't simply look after ourselves and leave some schools on the outside. Which is where, coming back to the middle tier level, I think moderating tensions, being the referee and probably taking responsibility for things like admissions is really important, so that schools are playing on a level playing field and feel more able to collaborate, because they know that no one's going to try and break the rules behind their backs. And then building capacity, enabling an evidence-informed practice. I mean, where that middle tier can help, I think, is helping to say, here's how we're doing and here's where we need to get better. Collectively, let's look at that and how we now learn together about how to improve. And finally, all of this needs to come with a culture in which we're celebrating innovation, we're seeing it as something valuable, we're absolutely rigorous about evaluating it, but we're not equally accepting that if we go for lots of innovation, we may well fail as we go, and we need to learn from that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a lovely note to finish on in terms of celebration and building trust, but I did like that collaborative thuggery term. I thought that had a lot of... it really speaks to the issue of social capital and that sense of obligation we feel to succeed together, and if we fail together, but yep. we're in it together. So thank you. We are a little over time, but has anybody got questions they'd like to put up for Toby before we close?
Toby, what would be one recommendation that you would have made to the ministry with the talks that you had about education
I guess I would say, I think continuing to build strong networks that are inclusive in the way that I think they're doing is a really important kind of step. I think then you've got to think about moving those networks to the next level so they can really start to do powerful work together, which probably means looking, as I've said, at the kind of middle tier. What kind of structure do you need around these networks to enable them to really fly? And I'd say, re-looking at school governance in relation to some kind of middle tier arrangement, not necessarily seeing that as the ministry, but as something probably new, some kind of commissioner role is probably where I would recommend going next.
Yes, Lyle.
Yeah, Toby, and I agree about celebrate the innovators, but also there's been a lot of stress on evidence-based learning, teaching, and that's all fine. But if you want to celebrate innovators, just as a comment, obviously you've got to let people do stuff often not based on evidence, because they're actually creating the new approach. But I've got to say, in this country right now, it may be a short time now, but you've picked up on the issues in terms of teacher recruitment, aging teacher force, all those sorts of things. It's very hard, isn't it, to develop an innovative culture in any organisation, business or not business. But it seems to be particularly hard for reasons you hinted at, in our very autonomous system, which no doubt will change with the present initiatives. But how do you get on innovating in a stressed system?
Yeah, good question. So I don't think, certainly we similarly have a teacher recruitment crisis, and I think innovation is difficult to do in education. I see quite a lot of innovation going on here. I think the innovative learning environments, for example, is hugely ambitious and seems to be getting some really interesting kind of, it's getting underway. It's not just at the edges anymore. So I think you're already innovating, and I would say the challenge is to evaluate. If you're innovating in an area where the evidence isn't yet strong, then the imperative of evaluating that is really strong, because we've seen so many blind alleys where we've thought that the answer is technology, and lo and behold, it wasn't, unless you did it in a certain way. So I would say, no easy answers. Partly about this framework that I'm talking about, I think you've got to kind of create a framework where it becomes safe to innovate and is seen as kind of something that's actively supported rather than something that puts you out on a limb and taking risks, and then invest in the evaluation of it so that you're learning as you're going.
Kathleen.
Thanks very much, Toby. I'm just interested in the OECD, and I'm sort of thinking, I suppose, in terms especially of some of the emphasis that's being put on focuses on focusing on processes and not structures, becoming flexible, adapting to change, and especially thinking about networks, the extent to which people are drawing on contemporary social theory to reconceptualise different forms of engagement, I suppose. And I'm just interested to know if that kind of work is going on, because there's all this contemporary social theory that's conceptualising the world and how you connect with networks in very different ways from the structure and agency debate. And I'm sort of thinking, is this going on? And if not, why not?
It is going on. Certainly, we've had Tracy at our place a couple of times, and she's one of a number of people at OECD who I would say are engaging with contemporary social theory. You can critique it without doubt. Is it a kind of adoption of the language of that whilst really kind of continuing to promulgate what's gone before? Of course, that's all possible, but I would say I'm impressed with the way that they seem to be, very proactively trying to think differently, and the way, for example, they've introduced creative problem solving and the other kind of new modules into PISA. They seem to be pushing a kind of more flexible approach to educational change. Yes, you can critique the kind of globalization of educational change. I get all of that, and it's problematic, but often, certainly from where I'm sat in England, where we have a very, very actually a kind of back to basics approach. We don't want any of that fluffy 21st century skills stuff. We just want knowledge in our curriculum, and we want children to be bored so that they're even more bored. Then I think it's helpful that you've got quite a forward-thinking international body that's prepared to engage in different ways of thinking about things.
I suppose I just think, how you conceptualise the world will determine how you can act within it. So if there's all these contemporary ways of conceptualising the world differently in terms of engaging in networks, it would be really useful to get a crack at taking them for a test drive.
Yep. But I mean, I think complexity theory would be one of those. So that, I'm not saying they've got every single tool in their toolkit, but I think they are trying to think differently. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for giving us your time this evening, and I welcome you to stay and talk if you have got time to do it and have a little bit more kai, but greatly appreciate your attendance. It's tremendous when we do have visiting academics from overseas, and there will be more prestige lectures available this year, so do come along. It makes it all worthwhile when we can share this kind of knowledge around. So thank you all. Thank you, Toby.
Thank you.
And kia ora.